and thank you for joining us for today's forum on the real estate transfer tax and Harley Clark referendums. I'm Julianne Dieterich, and together with Casey Christensen, we're the co-presidents of the League of Women Voters of Evanston. We'd like to thank ETHS for allowing us to hold today's forum here. The League of Women Voters is a national, nonpartisan political organization dedicated to promoting the active and informed participation of citizens in government. As a key part of that mission, our local league has a long tradition of holding forums to hear from candidates and to consider important issues on the ballot, and we're honored to continue that service today. You'll note on the back of your programs that we and our neighboring leagues will also be hosting a series of candidate forums for races in our districts next Saturday, October 20th, beginning at 9 a.m. in Wilmette Village Hall, and we hope you'll join us there as well. While the League advocates on certain issues at every level of government, our local league has not taken a position for or against either of the referendums that will be discussed today. In designing today's forum, our goal has been to provide a fair platform for a civil discussion of some of the key issues surrounding these two referendums. I'll introduce our moderator, Jan Flappen, in just a moment, and she'll explain the rules and format that will follow to help us achieve that goal. We'll begin with the panel discussing the real estate transfer tax referendum. I'd like to take just a moment to explain a bit about how the League selected the panelists. This referendum was placed on the ballot by City Council. So we reached out to the city to identify a speaker to explain that decision. Elected officials and city employees are prohibited from advocating for a referendum, but Hitesh Desai, the city's chief financial officer, is joining us today to provide factual information about the real estate transfer tax proposal. Because our research identified realtors as the primary public opponents of this referendum, we also invited the local Realtors Association to identify a panelist to share a perspective against the referendum. Bonnie Wilson, an Evanston realtor, is listed in your program as today's speaker, but she had a family emergency overnight and could not attend today. Her colleague, Joe Roth, the local government affairs director for Illinois Realtors, was going to be here today in a support role for Bonnie. With the agreement of the other panelists, Mr. Roth will read Ms. Wilson's opening statement and answer questions to the extent that he can. In his role, Joe supports realtors and property owners in communities along the North Shore. Prior to joining Illinois Realtors, Joe spent many years working in Evanston for such organizations as the American Massage Therapy Association and Rotary International. Finally, we thought that it would be useful to hear from an expert who is here not to take a position on the referendum, but to provide any empirical evidence or broader context that might help voters assess the potential impact of the referendum. Through outreach to local faculty at universities in the area, we identified Dr. Paula Worthington to share her expertise in real estate economics and public policy. Thank you all for agreeing to participate. Now I'm pleased to introduce our moderator, Jan Flappen. Jan lives in Chicago and is a former president of the Chicago League and of the League of Women Voters of Illinois. She has a wealth of experience moderating forums like these, and we thank her for volunteering her time today. Jan.
Thank you, Julianne. I'm going to go over some of the ground rules, but they are in your program, so I'm not going to repeat them all. No video or photography is allowed today, and post-forum usage, no duplication of anything. The entire forum will be on the League of Women Voters of Evanston's website. That's lwve.org, and it should be up in a day or two. No campaign literature may be distributed. Time limits, the league volunteers will keep the official time, and they'll display countdown cards. You want to hold up your cards just so the panel can see and the audience can see. And I'm responsible for enforcing the time limits. The audience is asked to remain silent during the forum, and please silence your phones or other electronic devices. And please do not respond in any audible way to panelists. I may interrupt the forum to enforce the rules if necessary. The referendum wording is in the program, and I urge you to read it if you haven't already. Each panelist will make an opening statement of 3 minutes in the following order. Hitesh Desai from the city of Evanston. He'll provide factual information from the city related to the referendum. And then Joe Roth from the Illinois Realtors. Finally, Paula Worthington will speak only if she feels there's some factual information in relation to the question. She will not make an opening statement. So, Mr. Desai, please go first.
Okay, thank you, Jane, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Hitesh Desai, the Chief Financial Officer with the City of Evanston. Right around June, July, the City Council kind of asked the staff to, as a part of the early budget process, to explore the various options of revenues and expenses. And one of the things on the revenue side was to explore the possibility of real estate transfer tax, and particularly having a progressive real estate transfer tax, where the tax amount goes up with the value in the home sold. And so finally, after a few deliberations with the staff and the City Council, the City of Evanston came out with this proposal which is there for the referendum in November, and which is keeping the rate up to $1.5 million on the value of the home sold at the same rate of $5 per thousand. The rate for any homes valued between 1.5 and the 5 million would go up to $7, so that's a $2 increase. And any homes above 5 million, the rate would go from the existing rate of $5 to the $9. Now, I looked at the 2017 data, and on an average, city, at least for the last 3 years, received around $3.6 million in the real estate transfer tax. And looking at the number of transactions by each category, in terms of value, we realized that less than 3% transactions were over 1.5 million. And I guess the City Council intent was to address that any low income or the houses valued less than the $1.5 million, which makes up 97% of the transactions, are not affected by the proposed increase in the real estate transfer tax. And accordingly, City Council decided to go with the proposed referendum in November. Thank you, and I'll, be short and have I think, let's have more time in the questions and answers. Thanks, Jim.
Before Mr. Roth speaks, I just want to say I've been corrected. Ms. Worthington does have an opening statement. So I apologize. Mr. Roth.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon. I'd like to thank the Evanston League of Women Voters for having this panel on the referendum to increase Evanston's real estate transfer tax. I'm here to represent the North Shore Barrington Association of Realtors. We sympathize with the city's budgetary problems and understand the tax increases for general fund. However, an already high transfer tax, an increase of up to 80% is just irresponsible. Realtors see a problem with this. We're the ones that help people buy and sell homes and properties. Part of the realtor's job is to help secure an equitable future. What are they going to say to a property owner when they decide to sell that property? Sorry for the added cost, but the city decided they deserve a piece of your equity. Oh, and there's no recovery of that at closing. Now, realtors don't have a crystal ball. We can't see what the market's going to be in next year, 2 years, 3 years. But city is budgeting an extra $800,000 approximately for this increase. But the simple fact is, transfer tax revenue is not reliable. Year to year, combined revenue sales for residential properties over $1.5 million can vary by as much as 40%. Commercial properties, which this really targets, are even more volatile, and those sales can vary by more than 90% year over year. Simply put, the city can't budget for this type of fluctuation. It's also important to note that commercial property owners are already paying more than their fair share in property tax. Those properties are currently assessed at 25% of their market value, while residential properties are assessed at 10%. So if commercial property owners are paying more in property taxes already, why should they also pay more in transfer taxes? But for us, the scarier question is, when do they say enough's enough? When does Evanston become too expensive to invest in? The community relies on the city to budget responsibly for their projects. Now, when they can't meet those expenses, they need to reevaluate the situation. But instead, we're being approached yet again, property owners, with new taxes. These are people that are already investing in the city and paying a large share of the expenses in the city. We think they offer more value than just a revenue stream. But let's face it, this is singling out certain property owners to bear the burden of poor budget management. Evanston property owners can't continue to be an endless stream of cash. Each month, we as consumers need to balance our checkbooks, and we expect the same of city officials. So realtors are asking voters to vote no on the increased transfer tax.
Thank you. Ms. Worthington.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to participate this afternoon. I'd like to use my time to just make a few observations about real estate transfer taxes in general, and then bring it down to the local level. About 35 states across the country have such taxes in place, either at the state or local level. Here in Illinois, we have modest state and county level transfer taxes, and we also have a structure in which home rule jurisdictions like Evanston can choose to impose additional local real estate transfer taxes. And as we know, under the status quo, Evanston's transfer tax rate is 0.5% of the sale price of the property, which puts it in the middle of the pack in terms of the range of tax rates established by municipalities and localities in Illinois, but there is a pretty big range there. Key to remember about real estate transfer tax revenues is that, again, under the status quo, we know that in recent years, they've generated a little over $3.5 million in revenues for the City of Evanston's general fund. It varies considerably from one year to the next. In the last few years, the range has been from about $2 million all the way up to about $4 million. Important to understand that at this time, under the status quo, the higher valued properties that change hands, the ones that would be subject to the new proposed rate structure, those properties, the sales of those properties represented less than 3% of the transactions, but almost a third of all the revenues raised by the current real estate transfer tax. Under the proposal, those higher valued properties will generate an even higher value and higher fraction of total revenues. It's also going to introduce a notch in the tax liability. That is, a property that sells for $1,499,999 is going to have a $3,000 lower tax liability than a property that sells for $1.5 million. And the evidence is that from other states is that when that happens, when you introduce those notches, you see clustering of property sales below the threshold and then sparse sales that happened right above the threshold. So it is sort of an awkward structure, and I guess I would just say that in Cook County, we classify commercial properties. They're assessed at different levels, and the tax rates are higher on commercial properties than residential. Thank you.
Thank you. From now until 2:40, there will be questions from the audience. The League has supplied some starter questions, and we will start with those. But first, I want to ask you, if you have not received index cards, please raise your hand, and an usher will come around. Please clearly print on the card your question. Questions will be screened only for duplication and relevance to the issues involved in the referendum. And raise your hand when you have finished your question, and they will pick up the cards. Each panelist will have 1 minute to respond to each question. And I've been given some leeway. If there's factual information being discussed, I will allow the panelists to go over a few seconds. I'm hoping they won't go over too much, as we do want to get in as many questions as possible. And then if they do go over, each panelist after that will be allowed the same amount of time. Since Mr. Desai made the first opening statement, Mr. Roth will respond to the first question, and then we'll alternate speakers, and Ms. Worthington can choose to speak or not. So, Mr. Roth.
Yes.
Go ahead. Oh, no, I'm sorry. We need the first question. I'm going to use one of the League's questions just to get us started. As proposed, the new real estate transfer tax would fall most heavily on properties valued at $5 million or higher, most of which are commercial or multifamily residential properties. How would this new structure affect the tax burdens of commercial versus real estate versus residential property owners?
It would dramatically impact them. They're looking at an 80% increase in this transfer tax liability, and I think the one thing we can't stress enough is that they're already paying more in property taxes. They're already at a 25% assessed value, and 80% makes it the 5th highest transfer tax in the state at $9 per thousand. That's, 5th highest is pretty significant, and how much pain can commercial and development bear is maybe the question we're asking here.
Thank you. Mr. Desai.
Just a comment on what is there. Yes, it looks big in terms of the percentage, but if you see, the rate is going up from 5 to 7, which is like a $2 for any properties between 1.5 and $5 million. And again, as I said, the city's focus was the city council and the city management that, okay, who is affected by this? Less than 3% of the properties would be affected by this. The rate when goes up from $5 to $9. I mean, we have roughly, 5 transactions last year in that category. Above $5 million. And again, I have the Chicago data here. They are at 1050 right now, and obviously it is split between buyer and seller. And real quick, I see the sign. What is this revenue used for in the general fund? For the social services, parks and recreation, streets, public safety, police and fire. So that is one of the important considerations too.
Thank you. Ms. Worthington, do you have anything to add?
I would comment that the Cook County property valuation and assessment system does indeed assess commercial properties at a higher rate than residential properties, so that commercial properties might represent, the last numbers I looked at, 17% of market value, but in terms of assessed value, about twice that. But the other thing to point out is that the real estate transfer tax is something that is paid once. It's paid at the time of a sale, whereas property tax obligations are things that we pay annually when we own property.
Thank you. The next question, I'm going to go to the audience questions as I'm getting some. What impact will the real estate transfer tax have on transit-oriented developments? Mr. Desai.
I mean, it is more for the, I think, the real estate association or some of those, developers. But I don't see, and again, I think as she mentioned earlier, this is a one-time thing. It's not something which is recurring, like you see the water rates. Like, okay, you pay the bill every month. Something which is quarterly, or the property tax even, which is an annual thing. This is a one-time thing, and even you are subject to that when you have to sell the property or when you sell the property, whether it's a residential or commercial. So in that sense, I don't see a much impact.
Thank you. Mr. Roth.
I would disagree with that. I think there is a process of building equity. People buy property to build equity, to grow wealth for themselves and their family, for future generations. And really, that's a direct hit on that equity. So when we're talking about development, if people are developing to then turn around and sell it, that's an additional cost that they're going to bear, and additional equity that's not theirs anymore.
Worthington. Okay. Next question. Mr. Roth, you will be first. Is the $1.5 million indexed to inflation? If not, why not?
Can I go ahead and skip that one? I'm not quite sure the answer to that.
Okay. Do you have an answer, Mr. Desai?
And I don't know, again, what's the purpose of that? Yes, I don't have the data in terms of, what would be the real value. But again, I would stress on the one thing, which is like looking at the data which I have from the last few years, and the properties which fall within those categories where you see the raise which is proposed in the referendum is like less than 3%. So I don't see a much impact overall.
Thank you. Ms. Worthington?
I don't know the city of Evanston's full tax structure, but or its fee structure for that matter, but I can guess that most of the tax rates and tax levies and fees and charges are not at this time indexed for inflation, and so it would not be uncommon for a jurisdiction to set something like this up without indexing it. Doesn't mean I'm saying that's a good idea or a bad idea. I'm just saying it's not uncommon. City of Oakland, California has a proposal on the ballot this fall that looks very similar to the one in Evanston, and those dollar figures for their thresholds and cutoffs are not indexed for inflation.
Mr. Desai, you will have the next question first. Most City of Evanston revenue tools are regressive forms of taxation. Is the transfer tax measure progressive or regressive?
Again, as we see the proposal, it is the progressive real estate transfer tax. Yes, the fact is that none of the cities, I think, in Illinois are currently using the progressive. There are few cities outside of the state of Illinois, they are using the progressive tax. But again, I guess I'll have to reiterate the fact that what would happen because of that, like instead of going for an overall increase for everybody versus going with the progressive tax and having the increase only on the properties above the $1.5 million is just to make sure that most of the transactions, close to 98% of the transactions, are not affected by this.
I think I would make the point on this that I think it'll have a regressive impact. I think that while there is this new revenue coming in from higher cost buildings and properties, we're assuming that the developers will continue doing business in Evanston, that the lower cost of doing business in neighboring communities won't impact them. And I think that's a dangerous assumption to make. I think.
Ms. Worthington?
So there are very few states and localities that have a progressive structure to their real estate transfer taxes. So there's not a lot of evidence out there. And what evidence there is mainly about residential properties, not commercial properties. Nonetheless, there's some evidence suggesting that the imposition of these progressive taxes with these notches does discourage some transactions from taking place. So it's not just that you see clustering below the threshold and then nothing much above, it's that there really are transactions of property that don't happen as a result of the tax being imposed.
Mr. Roth is going to have the next question. It's a little long. In Chicago, both buyer and seller pay transfer taxes. Wilmette buyers pay a transfer tax. Why not have Evanston buyers pay a modest transfer tax to bolster the city coffers and not increase the seller's transfer tax?
That's a great question. I know City Council shot down that idea of having a split transfer tax, and I'm not proclaiming that's a good idea, because for home buyers, specifically first-time home buyers, one of the big challenges they face is coming up with the cash at hand at closing, and that is money you have to have out of your pocket right when the closing's happening. So that is a hurdle for first-time home buyers. But that said, you know, what we have on the table today is a progressive transfer tax.
I guess, yeah, there is a twofold, I think, the reasoning for this kind of, the one thing which my colleague just explained, that, okay, that might hurt the first-time home buyer who is willing to buy a modest home, maybe for $100,000, $150,000, $200,000. Besides that, the second one, by going with the progressive tax, you're not affecting any homes up to $1.5 million. Now, I think the median home value in Evanston, I think well below $500,000. I guess we would touch how many properties, you know, in terms of percentage or as well as the numbers. So I guess considering both those things, there is no tax on the buyer side.
Ms. Worthington? The next question goes to Mr. Desai. Does Northwestern have to pay transfer taxes for buildings it buys?
It's a good question, and I guess the answer is no. When they buy, it's a transaction, yeah. If they buy from the outsiders, you know, they pay the transfer tax. I'll have to check, but I think they are exempt from the transfer tax, because we get hundreds of the transactions which are exempt, like a not-for-profit or some of the religious and all that, and we just charge the minimum $100 processing. But again, yes, I can just verify that, yeah.
Mr. Roth?
I have nothing to add.
Nor I.
All right, the next question is for Mr. Roth. Is a transfer tax on the total amount or just that over the $1.5 million or $5 million threshold?
The way the ballot question reads, it is on the total amount.
On the total amount?
Yeah, there would not be an additional $2 for every 1,000 over 1.5 million. It would be $7 for every $1,000 of the sale price, or $9.
Mr. Desai?
Yeah, that's correct.
Mr. Desai will be answering the next question. 15 to 20 years ago, there was a referendum to raise the real estate transfer tax with the additional money earmarked for affordable housing. Why isn't affordable housing included in the current referendum?
It's still included, and I mentioned indirectly, if you see the programs, and our estimate of the increased revenue is right around $800,000. And if you look at the referendum, that what would the funds be used for, the city's general fund? Where does the city's general fund used? Used for the improvements related to the public safety, which is police and fire services, public health, Parks and recreation, you see all the parks, the summer youth programs, the camps, the street improvements, and all other city necessaries. So considering those, and with the limited amount of 800,000 increased amount, affordable housing. But affordable housing has other means of sources, yeah.
Roth?
The city council did have the opportunity to earmark that and put that in the ballot question, and they chose to make this a general fund addition.
Ms. Worthington?
I can comment that the proposal in Oakland, California is very similar to the one in Evanston in that the additional funds generated under the proposal are directed to that city's general fund and not to specific programs.
I don't have any more audience questions, so I'm going to go to the league's questions again. How does the city propose, the next question goes to Mr. Roth first. How does the city propose to manage the potential volatility of real estate transfer tax revenues, which can vary significantly from year to year as the number and value of property sales change?
That's the very question we're afraid of. What's going to happen when they don't meet their revenue targets? What happens when high-end sales don't happen for a year and they only see 400,000 instead of 800,000? Are they going to come back and ask citizens to increase the transfer tax for all properties over 500,000, 250,000? The question will come back again once they don't meet the revenue targets.
Yeah, that's a good question. And again, the city does not intend to kind of keep on increasing the rates and then kind of solely rely on that. City has other sources of revenue, being the home rule community. There are multiple sources of revenue. But the city intends to keep, and again, I'll repeat, the funds used for some of the social services, for the health programs, public safety and parks, and city intends to continue the same level of service so that the Evanston residents and the businesses get the quality service.
Worthington? The next question goes to Mr. Desai. Evanston's 2019 proposed budget includes service reductions and fee increases to close a $7.4 million deficit. If the now there's two questions directed to both sides, so I'm going to just ask each one separately so that everyone will answer all the questions. If the referendum passes, what are some concrete examples of budget cuts or fee increases that could be avoided?
Again, as a part of the Budget Balancing Act, we haven't included the referendum amount as the city does not know the outcome yet. But again, city fully intends to, if the referendum passes through and with the increased revenue, city wants to continue, again, the services that provide in the field of public health, public safety, parks, recreation, streets, and others.
Roth?
I would say that you're going to see more cuts or more increases elsewhere because even if they realize this $800,000, making that assumption that it does indeed come to fruition, that's still 10% of the budget shortfall. That's a lot of ground to make up. So I would envision that you would still see either new revenue sources coming in or further cuts.
And for Mr. Roth, what if the referendum does not pass? What service reductions or fee increases would you favor instead to close the deficit?
We'd need to see more details to really provide any sort of concrete information or opinions on that. But we're happy to be of support and help.
I don't see that, as I mentioned earlier, it's not part of the right now budget balancing. So obviously I don't see any more fee increase or the service reduction beyond what you have already seen.
All right, there's one question which was partially answered, so I think I will go to that. And Mr. Desai will answer it first. How many properties in Evanston typically sell below 1.5 million, between 1.5 million and 5 million, and over 5 million?
Okay, so I'm going by the 2017 data, which I have for the full year. So in 2017, there were 9 properties over $5 million, 12 properties between $2 million and $5 million, and 13 properties between $1.5 million and 2. So out of 1,236 transactions, roughly 34 transactions were over $1.5 million. And the rest of that, almost 1,202 transactions were of the value up to $1.5 million.
Roth?
I don't have the data on me, but that sounds about right.
Ms. Worthington?
Defer to Mr. Desai.
Mr. Roth will be first. And the next question, how will the real estate transfer tax impact our most vulnerable residents trying to afford to stay in Evanston?
I think that's a good question. When you're looking at increased cost of doing business for small businesses, for local businesses, you're looking at an increase. I think if they're seeing a higher cost of doing business, they're going to have to pass that along to consumers.
I mean, I would keep my comments to 2 things. There is no tax on the buyer, so obviously it doesn't prohibit from someone who is buying the modest home and pay the higher taxes. It's on the seller. The second thing is, as long as you are going to live in that, this is a one-time kind of and you have to pay this on the sale. So I don't see kind of any impact in that sense.
Ms. Worthington?
I might observe that we often try to keep in mind a distinction between who writes the check to pay a tax and then who ultimately really bears that tax, perhaps through the form of depressed prices or wages or increased prices or wages. So, you know, for example, it may be the case that certain commercial properties have tenants, and so any increase in the cost of running that commercial property and acquiring it and maintaining it could be passed along partially to those tenants, who in turn would perhaps pass on parts of it to their own stakeholders and people they engage with. And on the residential side, I would just say there's 2 sides to the transaction, and just because one side writes the check doesn't mean there isn't some bargaining going on before you get to the transaction to close.
Thank you. And that concludes our questions and concludes this panel. I thank the panelists very much for participating. I ask the audience to stay seated while we change panels.
Thank you.
Thank you again to our first panel. We appreciate their participation. For those of you who joined us late, I'm Julianne Diederich, co-president of the League of Women Voters of Evanston, and we're delighted that you're here with us today to consider the 2 referendums that are on the ballot in Evanston. We turn now to a panel discussing the Harley Clark referendum. As a reminder, the League of Women Voters of Evanston does not have a position on this referendum. Before our moderator explains the game plan for this second panel, I wanted to say a few words again about how we selected our panelists. You may have noticed that there's been a fair bit of discussion in the community about the Harley Clark mansion. We couldn't possibly represent all of the viewpoints on this referendum in a manageable panel. As you consider your vote, we encourage everyone to inform yourselves about views that aren't reflected here today. Today, we decided to invite 4 speakers, 2 on each side of the referendum, to allow for a variety of views while also ensuring that the panel would have time to address as many questions from the audience as possible. We sought speakers who would have expertise or experience that might be particularly relevant as voters weigh the specific language of the referendum. To identify potential speakers, we reviewed relevant council meetings, editorials, and the proceedings of both of the advisory committees that have considered Harley Clark. We also reached out to our own league members who monitor city council meetings on our behalf, and to the mayor and the Evanston Roundtable for suggestions. We invited suggestions from Save Harley Clark, which is the group that collected the petitions to place this referendum on the ballot, and we reached out to the Evanston Lighthouse Dunes group, which has a memorandum of understanding with the city to potentially finance demolition of the mansion. All of our panelists today came to our attention through multiple means. We invited Trish Stieglitz and Brad White to share their perspectives favoring the referendum. Ms. Stieglitz brings expertise on construction issues, and Mr. White brings expertise on preservation and adaptive reuse. They were both among the potential speakers suggested by Save Harley Clark. Amina DeMarco and Craig McClure join us to share views against the referendum. Ms. DeMarco brings experience from working on one of the Harley Clark advisory panels and on the Lakefront Master Plan. Mr. McClure's community involvement in Evanston has centered on his concern about our tax burden. I'll note that Evanston Lighthouse Dunes declined to participate in the panel because they as a group have not taken a position on the referendum, but they did suggest potential speakers, including Ms. DeMarco. Mr. McClure has donated to Evanston Lighthouse Dunes, but neither he nor Ms. DeMarco are speaking for that group today. We thank all of you for agreeing to share your views with us. We know that this isn't an easy task. With that, I welcome again our moderator, Jan Flappen.
Thank you, Julianne. I will just remind people of the rules. The audience is expected to remain silent, and please silence your phones or any electronic devices. And again, this form will be on the website of the Evanston League, lwve.org. You can go there in the next couple of days, and it should be up. Each panelist is allowed an opening statement of 2 minutes, and they drew straws before. The order of the speakers is as follows. Mr. McClure will go first, and then Ms. Stieglitz, Mr. White, and Ms. DeMarco. And we will start with Mr. McClure. You have 2 minutes.
Great. So I want to thank the League for inviting me here today. Many in city government know me as I've been quite outspoken since my partner and I arrived here in Evanston back in 2004. My speaking out has been around our tax burden and on fiscal issues. And let me just say, and some of my neighbors who are here know this, being a moderate Democrat from Pennsylvania makes me more conservative than many of you. I get that. Just yesterday, a neighbor said that I must hate Evanston because of my stance on the Harley Clark, and nothing is further from the truth. I just look at it and realize that our tax burden was high when we got here, and it has only gotten higher. I always look at things in context, so here's the context I'm going to offer. The city is trying desperately to avoid a tax increase for 2019. And I don't know if you've looked at the budget, but there are 39 staff positions that would be eliminated. There's a firehouse that will close. The city is also in the midst of the Robert Crown rebuild to the tune of $65 million. The capacity to support nonprofits in Evanston, there's only so many dollars to go around. On the Harley Clark itself, and I know we're going to debate this, I don't see enough architectural significance there to warrant saving it. History, we've already got the Dawes House, we've got the Francis Willard House. We don't need more public space in Evanston, especially space that isn't going to pay its own way. We don't need another ecology center. So when I take all of that context, I'm a no on the referendum because I know ultimately the city would have to pay something if the mansion is going to remain. And I'm not the only one. I've spoken with some of my neighbors, and they're a no as well. Thank you.
Ms. Stieglitz?
Thank you for inviting me to speak today in support of saving Harley Clark. My name is Trish Stieglitz, and I have over 35 years' experience working in the real estate and construction industry. I've called Evanston home for the past 30 years. We chose Evanston as a place to raise our children. We and everyone in this room continue to make the choice to live here because Evanston is a special place. It is a place of great beauty, both natural and built, of diversity, tolerance, inclusivity, and care. We call ourselves Evanstonians with pride and respect, but the plan to demolish Harley Clark flies in the face of these qualities that make us so special. As Evanston's only public lake house and a noted contributing structure in the National Historic Register, Harley Clark represents simultaneously what Evanston was and what Evanston forever aspires to be, an inclusive and welcoming community with facilities and places for everyone, regardless of race, age, or ability. Demolition of a public asset at the behest of 6 private individuals in a city of 75,000 is wrong and sets a terrible precedent, especially when the overwhelming cry from the community has been for preservation. The effort to save Harley Clark has wide support. Shop windows and bulletin boards all over town carry this message. 87% of respondents supported renovation or preservation in a city-sponsored survey. There is a path forward. Even our own state and national representatives have voiced their support and are now aligning resources to spare the building from demolition. I'm grateful to have the platform today to answer questions and clarify the facts and myths that exist and have been perpetuated. Some of the most important issues I hope to highlight will be Harley Clark and the voice of equity, the true cost of demolition, both financial and environmental, and the democratic process as it relates to Harley Clark. Transparency and civic involvement have long been the cornerstones of our local government. However, the handling and now rushed advancement towards demolition run counter to these tenets. It has been many, many decades.
Thank you.
One sentence.
Mr. White?
I want to thank the League of Women Voters of Evanston. And also I want to let everyone know that, just so everyone knows, I have been involved in preservation in Evanston for quite some time and want to reveal that I did help draft the historic preservation ordinance that exists today, just to be, so everybody knows. I think it's unfortunate that we're here in this position today and that we're even having this discussion, because what we have is a significant public asset, Harley Clark Mansion, that should have been taken care of years ago. I think, and also it is an architectural, it has significant architectural and cultural significance. And if we only saved those architecturally significant Mies van der Rohe, Frank Lloyd Wright, and a couple of historic sites in Evanston, then we wouldn't even be talking about Foster School today. And Foster School is up for landmark designation. It has little remaining architectural significance because it has changed over the years, but it has very significant history and still has some architectural significance, but it has very significant history, particularly in the 5th Ward, and particularly to the African American community. I also think it's unfortunate that we're here. In my 30 years of experience in doing historic preservation, these things get done all the time. Reuses of buildings happen all the time. Reuses for community uses happen all the time. You know, we've gone through the Tawani proposal, the Citizen Advisory Committee, which I actually have gone back and read, and it was very disappointing that there were no conclusions. They did a great job getting public engagement. And 87% of the people said that Harley Clark should be saved. And here we are today, still not with a reuse. And probably most significant is the last RFP process we went through, which I think ended very unfairly. And I still wonder why we're not moving forward on the reuses that were suggested during that program. So thank you.
Ms. DeMarco?
Thank you I also want to thank the League of Women Voters for putting together this forum and for inviting me to sit on the panel today. As you can read from my bio, I have been involved with Parks and Recreation in Evanston for many years, and I have experienced and watched the community debate the use and restoration of Harley Clark for the past 7 years. We know that this has been a very contested debate, and I'm aware that my position of demolition is unappealing to most. But just because something is unappealing doesn't mean that it is invalid, uninformed, or thoughtless. In fact, I think it's quite the opposite. It is not a decision that one comes to lightly or quickly. This is where I think the referendum language fails us all. Most would prefer to preserve Harley Clark at no cost to the city and community. However, if it were that simple, it would have been done and the debate would be over. Hopefully through the forum I can address why demolition is the most equitable solution, and at the same time it ensures public access to all in perpetuity. Thank you all for attending, coming here today to listen to this discussion. I hope everyone please vote on November 6th, whichever way you vote, and please, please visit the city's website for Harley Clark and inform yourselves of the facts on that page. Thank you.
Thank you. From now until 4 o'clock, a little over an hour, we are going to have audience questions, and luckily we have a lot so far. So please, if you don't have an index card and want one, raise your hand, and usher will come around and give you one, and then raise your hand again when you finish so the usher can collect it. Please clearly print your question, and question sorters may combine duplicate questions or reword slightly for clarity and brevity. Each panelist will have 1 minute to answer, and if a question calls for a more factually detailed explanation, I have the leeway to allow a little bit extra time. However, I'm hoping there won't be too much leeway asked for, and because we want to get through a lot of questions, and with 4 panelists, it's going to be hard to get through too many if everybody gets extra time. If someone does get extra time, then the panelists after that person will get the same amount of time. I will call on the panelists in rotating order, and we will go not in the order on the podium because we are going to go pro-con, pro-con. And please submit your questions toward the panel in general, not to one person. So I'm going to start with Ms. Stiglitz, and you will have the first question. Will any of the proposals for the Harley Clark site further equity efforts in the city?
Yeah, that's a great question. The equity question is of social justice, and the comments of Bennett Johnson, Peggy Tarr, Charles Smith, Carl Sutton, and many others have been completely disregarded, not only here today, but every time they get up to speak at a city council meeting, nothing happens. And this house is the only house on the mansion that is for every single person in the city. Equity isn't also just about color. It also means age and ability. And we've had older adults who have asked to keep the house so that they can sit in there on a winter day and enjoy the lake view. We have no other building on the lake front at all.
Thank you. Mr. McClure?
I don't personally see an equity issue here, and if the goal is to have a sunroom that people can sit in on the lakefront, there are far cheaper ways we could do it.
Ms. DeMarco?
Yeah, I can really think of no other more equitable solution than it being a park, and really, truly, honestly having access for everyone at any given time. I think you have to start with what you consider access or what you consider public, and I consider something public as if you have access to it. So far, I don't think that in the 40 plus years that the city has owned Harley Clark that most of us have actually had access to that space. When it was the Art Center, you had to take a class. You could possibly go there once or twice a year when they had exhibitions. I had been there once for an art encounter event at the Art Center, and the only other time I had been there was to walk through as a member of the special committee. I never found it to be accessible as a citizen, as a Fourth Ward citizen, as a parent with 3 children. I can't think of any other way that everyone could have free and equal access than having it be a public park.
Mr. White.
To me, access is more than just being open to the public. Access means people being able to get there. I think if you look at Lighthouse Beach, I think it is far from accessible to our entire Evanston community. There's no public buses that run close to it. There's no public transportation that runs close to it. The uses that have been proposed for the Harley Clark include providing transportation to get to the uses, providing transportation to get to the classes, providing transportation to ensure that it is open to all of Evanston. Thank you.
Okay, the next question, the first question will go to Mr. McClure. How can the use of the Harley Clark Mansion become an economic engine for the city?
I actually don't see that it can become an economic engine for the city. I believe that if the city were to try to attempt to repurpose that facility, it will just wind up being a white elephant sitting in the northeast corner that will be underutilized, and it will be yet another expense that the city cannot bear.
Ms. DeMarco.
I'm in agreement with Mr. McClure as being an economic engine for the city. I think that most people don't really want a lot of economic growth. At the lakefront, they would prefer responsible growth there. I think there is a way to do that if the city was to take that on as a site where they could have a boat launch, or there's always need for additional racks for boats and things like that. I think there is a way to responsibly put some of that there where the city could make some money. I think that's really the crux of the issue, that in order to do so, to have it be an economic engine, it's going to have to be privatized. I think that's my fear, that eventually this site will be privatized, and I think we all lose if that happens. Thank you.
Mr. White?
I suspect the cost of a boat launch would be pretty high, particularly to get environmental approvals for it and such. But I do think that the Harley Clark could be an economic engine. It's not going to be an economic engine like some of the downtown development that we see. It's going to be the economic engine first of the rehabilitation of it, so that will employ construction workers, that will employ special trades. It could also even have some employment training going along with it. Then the other uses, which are lighter than your typical commercial uses, would also have some economic engine, but is it going to be a great generator of property taxes in the city of Evanston? No, and neither will the park that is being proposed.
Ms. Stiglitz?
I do think that there's a possibility that it could be an economic engine. Will it bring in a lot of dollars? No, but adaptive reuse of historic structures has been successful in models just like this throughout the country and world, and every dollar invested in historic preservation returns $2.44 to the community. We had a viable plan for use of the building, and it was at no cost to the city. Right now, the building costs $15,000 a year to maintain. $15,000, and that money has been offered by several people to the city of Evanston so that it would cost $0. But I do think that there can be a successful model, and some of them are Uptown Theater in Chicago, Highfield Hall in Massachusetts.
I know, I'm fixing it. Thank you. The next question is going to go to Mr. White first. If Harley Clark is not retained now, how should the city move forward with its ownership of the property?
Harley Clark is not retained now.
Retained?
So if Harley Clark is demolished?
The word was retained, so
Okay.
I guess that means demolished. But the city still owns the property?
Well, I don't really have an opinion on that. There will be annual costs for the property that the city will have to incur, and they say they cannot undertake annual costs on the property. I suppose that they could rezone it and sell it off. I know there have been drawings that indicate that nine single-family lots could be put there, and I suppose those would be pretty valuable. But I don't have an opinion on what the city should do if they tear down the building.
Ms. DeMarco?
So I think if we don't demolish now is how I'm interpreting the question, but I could be wrong. We run the risk of lots of things. I think my fear is that, again, of privatization. If you look back on the special committee and read the opinions that were there, I think what you will see is that there were people who were in favor of privatization, and they can speak to that through the city council. And if we do privatize it again, we risk losing the land. We have been talking and discussing and debating this for many, many years. I don't know where everybody is coming to this in their history or what they know about it, but we've been through this. We've had requests for proposal. A lot of these ideas have been vetted, and we keep coming back and back to what we want. I don't think none of the NPOs have had enough traction and have taken hold. And again, my fear is that the council will change the zoning and sell it off. That drawing for the 9 houses was done as part of the special committee. It was not drawn by anyone in particular.
Thank you. Mr. McClure.
So my viewpoint on the Harley Clark has actually evolved through the years. So when we were new in Evanston and the bed and breakfast proposal came up, I thought, you know what, maybe not a bad idea. But now I've come to understand, okay, lakefront, we're not going to sell that. One of my neighbors suggested that there is an in-between model, and there's something called a leasehold, which is very common in the UK, where for 99 years, someone could control that property. And maybe in 99 years, Evanston will be in a better position than it is now.
Thank you. The next question will go first to...
I didn't get a chance there.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Go ahead.
I think if they, really, I truly believe that demolition of Harley Clark, which, by the way, is the only house that will ever be able to go into, most of the people in here, a mansion on the lakefront. If they knock it down, it's the first step to becoming privatized. And I've seen some of the FOIA documents on some of the websites that show 9 houses, show a pathway to get there, and where does it stop? And then all of a sudden, Noah's playground goes and the beach goes. So keeping Harley Clark, I think, is a critical point. As for working on this issue for so many years, this issue hasn't cost the city a lot of money. The city manager even said so. Evanston Lake House and Gardens worked in earnest for 3 years on this plan. They had 2 proposals. They were the only people that had a viable proposal, and it cost the city absolutely no money. And they went to a lease, and while they were doing lease negotiations, the demo group was on the other side sending emails about how to demo the property. So I think that there's a clear path that other people have that we don't know about, and it's a slippery slope. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question will go first to Mr. White. If the building does get knocked down, what will be built in its place?
9 homes, I guess. I mean, I want to go back to this issue of all that has been done by the city. The city has issued 2 RFP processes. The first one, the Tawanis responded to, and it wasn't even consistent with the city request for proposal. And they still decided to try to negotiate with them, and it was not successful. There was one other RFP process, and the city basically stopped negotiating with the proposer. I don't see, the city hasn't led at all. In contrast to the Robert Crown, the city was leading there. Robert Crown wouldn't be happening without city leadership, because you wouldn't be able to raise money without the city saying this is going to happen. And that's why no organization's been able to raise money for Harley Clark, the city has continually start and stopped and has never made a commitment that this thing is moving forward, with or without city funds.
Thank you. Mr. McClure.
One of the things I want to point out about the Lake House Group proposal that I thought was actually very risky for the city was that one little clause in there that said that if the structure was 80% or more damaged, the city would be on the hook for rebuilding it. And on that clause alone, I was thankful that the one alderman brought that up, and that ultimately it got voted down. As far as what would happen on the site, I think the Lake House Dunes Group is very clear in that it would become open space. It is not about selling the property, become open space. Some of the Jens Jensen would be preserved, as I understand it, and it would remain, accessible to the public.
Thank you. Ms. Stiglitz.
I think if the house is torn down and they go with the demolition group's ideas, which have changed, by the way, from day one to today, first of all, it will cost the taxpayers money. Their offer is $400,000 for demolition, and that's based on no engineered drawings and no facts. The Dunes Group proposal originally started out with retention of the gardens and rebuilding the entire site, and now it's turned into, we'll tear down the building and give you $100,000. So I'm not sure what they should do. I don't think they should tear it down. It will cost us money if they do.
Thank you. Ms. DeMarco.
Okay, if the building is torn down, it will go to a public process. It's a public park, and all public parks who go through renovation and rehabilitation have a public revisioning process, all of them. That process will be completely public. The Dunes Group may have their recommendations, but that does not mean that that has to happen. So that's what will happen. They have had bids for demolition, and those range from $80,000 to $250,000. All of that, again, will go out for bid if the decision is made to tear down the house. There will be a bidding process. It will be public, and it will be transparent. In addition to that, the 9 homes that you speak of, I just want to go back to that very quickly. As part of the Harley Clark Special Committee, many of the committee members asked staff to prepare information, and that is what came out of that. The committee members requested, and our charge was to explore all options in exploring a private sale, real estate or otherwise, how they could divide that. That's where that's come from. It's not come from the Dunes Group or anyone else.
Thank you. The next question goes first to Ms. Stiglitz. Please give a clear explanation of how the Harley Clark proposal will affect the trees on the entire Lighthouse lakefront area.
Harley Clark proposal? I'm not following that because there isn't one.
That's the wording, the referendum.
Could you read it again for me?
Please give a clear explanation of how you think the Harley Clark proposal will affect the trees on the entire Lighthouse lakefront area.
Well, anytime you come in with bulldozers and start tearing down a building, the foundations, and there's a large basement underneath that building, you tear it down, there's a retaining wall that sits a couple feet above the parking that is going to be destroyed, and the tree roots that grow for 200 years, those trees are over 200 years old, some of them, and you're going to hit those, and the trees will be affected, the gardens will be affected. The grotto has pumps that are fed from the conservatory. So no one's addressed the fact that if you demo the building, how are you going to keep the grotto operational? The Jens Jensen Gardens are a really important, significant part of that property, and there's no path to fixing it that I've seen at all.
Thank you. Mr. McClure.
And I don't have all the details. I've been asking some questions, and what I have been told from the Dunes Group is that 95% of the trees on the site would remain with the proposal that they're putting forward. And we can talk about all the challenges of demolition, but when you get down to the bottom line, any effort to restore and then continue to operate that mansion, those costs are going to be far greater than anything we would encounter in the demolition.
Thank you. Mr. White.
I think the important part to look at here is that There is no dunes proposal. I've not seen a proposal for what's going to happen to this site. And I think Amina mentioned that if it turns into a park, this goes to the public for public engagement to figure out what the park is. To me, this all goes to the fact that we have no idea what the cost of the dunes proposal is. We know that we have to under that proposal, the building gets torn down. We know that under that proposal, the basement is going to have to be removed, and a large portion of that site is going to have to be filled with something. We also know that some trees will come down. I don't know how many, but there is no plan for what this site is. We do not know how much it will cost the taxpayers of Evanston to undertake this plan because there is no plan.
Thank you. Ms. DeMarco.
Regarding the trees, I'm not an arborist. I don't think anyone on this panel is, but I've also spoken to people who have walked the property, who are within the landscaping field, and my understanding is that most of the trees on that property are not of much significance. In fact, many are junk trees. I believe there's about 2 oak trees on the property that are valued. I don't think that we're going to lose a lot of trees in this process. But again, not an arborist, no one on the panel is. The dunes proposal is for demolition, and they have, I believe in reading again their MOU and what's on the city's website, that they have offered to, again, help fund whatever comes through the visioning in the public process. So I know that they are for preservation in dunes, but the whole point of it is that it will be a public process.
Thank you. The next question will go to Mr. McClure to start, and we're going to stay with the environment. Does the demolition plan include an environmental impact study? Does this include possible asbestos removal and any impact on the beach?
So my position there would be that, whether the mansion is torn down or renovated, there probably is asbestos somewhere in that building that's going to have to be dealt with. Either way. So I think you can just say that question, you're going to have to deal with it on either front. I don't think it's an issue, and I think it can be done in such a way that the lakefront is not impacted long term.
Mr. White.
I don't know if there's asbestos in the building. I assume, like Mr. McClure, that there is likely.
Speak into the mic, please.
There is likely to be asbestos in the building, and he is correct that either way there may have to be some asbestos abatement. Obviously, if the building is torn down, it's a different story than if the building is saved. There are ways to abate asbestos without actually removing it. You can encapsulate it if you keep the building. It will all have to be removed. And I don't think those environmental issues are dealt with in the estimate for removal of the building. And that's why I keep saying that we do not know the cost.
Ms. DeMarco.
I would assume that, again, through city processes, anytime they do put a request for a proposal on building, demolition, all of that, there is always an environmental concern, and it's within the scope of the proposal, so it would be dealt with at that time.
Ms. Stiglitz.
Yeah, thank you. Demolishing Harley Clark is going to be a costly and environmental nightmare. There is asbestos. In 2003, there was a report that showed abatement cost of $30,000. The city is still carrying about that number, and that was from 2003. Not only that, there's an underground storage tank that's by the coach house. They removed one in 1991 that was by the main house, and there's indications that there's one under the coach house, right by the coach house. Removing a 3,000-gallon underground storage oil tank is very expensive. None of that has been contemplated at all. In addition to that, the energy required to demo Harley Clark is equal to the energy required to power 2,452 homes a year. Reports, asbestos, lead paint, mold, all of it is in the house. So even if it'll have to be remediated, and they know it and they have reports about it, demolition will send 10,000 tons of materials to landfill, 10,000 trees worth of old growth lumber, 50 truckloads of valuable reusable.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. White, you will have the next question. How have minority voices been included in the decision-making process related to the public use of Harley Clark?
I don't pretend to speak for minorities. I don't think any of us up here can. So I cannot truly answer that question. All I can do is observe what I've seen based at the meetings that I've been at, particularly the city council, where I don't think any voices are heard particularly well in a 1-minute public speaking where you have 60 or 70 people speaking and they get 1 minute. I do know that there have been many African Americans in attendance at those meetings, and many of them have spoken. But I do not pretend to be able to speak for the minority communities of this community.
Thank you. Ms. DeMarco.
And I'm in agreement that I don't want to speak for other people. I don't see a lot of representation at city council meetings. In fact, that's one of the reasons why I got involved in the Parks and Recreation as a volunteer for the advisory board, because I didn't see people like myself going to community meetings about how our parks were going to be designed or rebuilt. I can say that there's never any youth engagement in any of these processes, which is really a sticking point for me. I spoke with the senior club this past week that meets at Fleetwood Jourdain, and it's a group of mostly African American elderly individuals in Evanston, and I can say that they didn't have a lot of knowledge on what was going on. It's a very minor issue in their community. There's a lot of other more important things going on in their community than Harley Clark.
Thank you. Ms. Stiglitz.
I actually couldn't agree less. I think that we all know Evanston is a coveted lake house, and all of the lakefront property, and this is the only one that's public, is the only place that anyone could go to. Economically privileged group of residents, perhaps the most important reason to preserve the Harley Clark is so that any Evanston can enjoy it year-round, access to a home on the lake so that the resident from any ward can experience. Many members of the African community did get up and speak at City Council. I've named them: Bennett Johnson, Peggy Tarr, Charles Smith, Carlos Sutton. The last council meeting, there were a number of them, and they were very upset that this house is going to be torn down. So I think it is all about social justice, and keeping this lake on the home is the only place we have.
Thank you. Mr. McClure.
And like Brad, I don't pretend to know what the minority community thinks of this. I do wish it were more than 5 people that you mentioned that actually had a voice in this process. I suspect that the majority is more where Ms. DeMarco said, where it's simply not something important. And I do want to maybe correct one thing that you said in your opening statement, because I think you're making it sound like 6 people support the Dunes Group. The Dunes Group actually has 75 people across the whole city supporting it now. So it is not just about some elitist neighbors. And I would suggest that preserving the mansion is actually a very elitist effort.
Excuse me.
Thank you. The next question is going to go to Mr. White first. How does your group, with your respective plans, envision increasing diversity in this part of Evanston?
My group?
A question, or you can take it personally.
I will answer this. I don't believe I represent any group here. I'm not a member of any group. I have worked with the Save Harley Clark people, though. But the reuses that I have seen for the building are reuses that would attract people from all over Evanston, and the environmental education. For example, the Lake House and Gardens proposal was to have environmental education for the youth, and would be used by them, and you would get They would have transportation to get people there. There would be programs, just like we have programs around the city that they could take advantage of. So I think that's how it would be open to the youth. And as we've discussed already, it would be open to everyone.
Mr. McClure.
I'm going to pass on this question.
Okay. Ms. Stiglitz.
So when I mention names, Bennett Johnson or Peggy Tarr or any of them, they're leaders in the African American community. And they specifically believe that this is an equity issue. That's why they come. They come and they represent their neighborhoods and the people that can't get there. And the Evanston Lake House and Gardens, like Brad said, they were about bringing kids from all neighborhoods. They had buses, and it was not a cost issue. It wasn't going to cost anybody a dime, but they were bringing kids to this building on a regular basis. And kids do come to the fog houses, but they have to get there on their own. Here, they had a plan, and it was all about equity. And so I would say that this is a social issue again, and it's a third place, and people need a third place, and many in the African American community don't have a third place.
Thank you. The next question,
I didn't get to a chance to respond to that last question.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. I'm just going to take this from a strict Parks and Rec perspective. What is the highest and best use of this property? It is a mansion. It is a home. That is what its best use as. Using it for anything other than that, you're going to have a lot of issues with changes, with restoration, or with purpose. It's very costly to do that, and I don't think it's something that we should be spending the citizens' money on. The city in 40-plus years has not been really willing to take this on as an asset. They could take it on as a civic center and do programming, but they have not done so. So let's ask us why. They're not sitting at this table explaining that, and they have not been able to. They've not been willing or able to make this into some kind of a use that will give back. So this is my fear in doing the same thing through a nonprofit. Civic centers are 50% subsidized. We all pay for our civic centers. We can't afford another one. I don't see how a nonprofit group is going to continue to have something that's 50% subsidized for a long length of time. It's a lot of fundraising there.
Thank you. Mr. McClure will be the first to answer the next question. What is the difference in cost to the city between preservation and demolition?
Well, I don't have all of the figures, but what I understand is that structure can be demolished for somewhere around $400,000 total. Preservation, I think the sky's the limit on what that will cost. The number I've heard is $7.5 million. Frankly, even if you got it down to $3 or $4 million, it's still more than Evanston can afford.
Ms. Stiglitz.
Thanks. I've been waiting for this question. Actually, the pamphlet that you handed out had numbers in it. And I gotta say that the first one for 20 estimate at $5 million is like apple and oranges that we're talking about. $5 million, he was building a hotel. He was putting 55 rooms, a 200-car parking garage, and he was eliminating spots that we already own. That just shouldn't even be on here. So that number is wrong. But I will say at $5 million, the city had an estimate to renovate and bring the building up to code in 2017. And I found the plans and I found the estimate. It was $660,000. So $5 million, wrong. As for the demolition, they have $450,000. There's about 30 items that aren't even accounted for on their own paperwork that says excluded, 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 that they need to pay for. And until they do engineered drawings and until they have experts in there with reports, they can't tell you how much it's going to cost. No cost is by keeping the building. People have offered to give the city $15,000 to pay for what the city manager says it takes. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you. How many seconds did she go over? 20 seconds. All right. So the remaining people will get, well, actually, just Mr. White is the remaining.
I could talk longer.
So you will get 20 seconds extra.
to me? I'm sorry.
I don't know.
Okay, I'll go.
Don't worry about
Okay.
it, yeah.
Cost of demolition preservation. Okay, so the cost of demolition ranges, again, from the city's estimates from $80,000 to $250,000. 3-4 years ago, during the special committee, it was about $60,000 to $200,000. So in my mind, that's about where it should be. Preservation, again, we don't know exactly what the adaptive use is going to be, so we don't really know what that cost is going to be for now. It's everything that you had stated, Trish, is exactly for demolition can be said about preservation and what that will be. Bringing the building up to code for $600,000 is ADA and any kind of electrical stuff that needs to be done. It doesn't include expanding the kitchen, which if any of you have been in there is nothing. It's a tiny little galley. Our kitchens are better, most of our kitchens in our home are better than what exists now. They'd have to, for an event space, they'd have to have a much bigger kitchen. They'd have to have additional bathrooms. So $600,000 isn't anywhere near what it would cost to take the house as it exists into some kind of a hybrid adaptive event space. And again, we don't know exactly what that is, so thank you.
Thank you. Mr. White.
I want to be, I guess, as clear as possible, and it's hard to when we don't have good numbers because we haven't had, particularly on the demolition and the redo of the building. As I said before, we have, on the redo of the land, we have no idea what the land is going to be, even if it's going to be a park. So we have no idea what the cost of getting that land to parkland will be. We have maybe some idea of what the costs of demolition are, which are, in some estimates, roughly $300,000, but again, there's a lot left out of that. What the proposals that have been out there and the proposals that I think we're supporting are no cost to the city. Now, you can believe whether that can happen or not, but I do think with city leadership in saying, yes, we're behind this effort, and the not-for-profit organizations come together and raising funds, they will raise the money necessary to open this building. So to speculate whether they will or not, that's up to you, and obviously. But what the proposals we're talking about here are cost to the city and no cost to the city. And reuse of that building at no cost to the city is what we're supporting.
Thank you. The next question is going to go first to Mr. McClure. Please state clearly the most important reason that you think an Evanston voter should vote for or against this referendum.
I can appreciate that Brad is saying no cost to the city. The problem is the referendum doesn't say that. It says minimal or no cost to the city. I'm a very strict constructionist. If the referendum clearly said no cost to the city, I might be in a different camp. But I will say that when I think about the structure, the last thing we need in there is another underfunded nonprofit like we had for 40 years with the EAC. And I'm sorry, but part of why we're having the conversation today about the sad shape of the mansion is because a lot of work that should have been done in those 40 years was not done.
Mr. White.
I think it's kind of humorous to talk about an underfunded EAC, or Evanston Arts Center. If you go down Central, where they have their new building, it seems that they were able to raise the funds for that, and perhaps there was something else going on with the city, which gets behind the reasons why they were unable to rehab the Harley Clark mansion. I think the most important thing to say is this is a cultural and architectural, beautiful building, but it's a building that can be reused for all of Evanston. And that's really what I believe is the important thing to tell our constituents. At no cost, it can be reused. It can become a center on the lake. There are no centers on the lake. We have a lot of beaches on the lake, but nothing for our community where they can come and learn about the lake and see the lake and learn there.
Thank you. Ms. DeMarco.
Yeah, I think it's important, the most important reason to vote no on it is, because of the language. I mean, really, the language of it doesn't really do anybody any good. It should be more of a cost value as to what demolition would cost and what the value is there and what preservation and the value is. That would be a better referendum in my mind. So I think just voting no because it's a poorly worded, it's just not a good referendum to begin with. The other reason is that, like, as you brought up, the Art Center, there were a lot of issues with the Art Center for many, many years. And they were able to raise the money as soon as they left. They didn't use any of that money to return Harley Clark to its original shape when they took it. They just simply walked away and left their kiln and walls and everything up. What's to say it's going to be any different with any other nonprofit? And that's where I'm coming from. This is my problem with having a nonprofit there. Sorry, that's all I
Thank
have.
you. Ms. Stieglitz.
So it's $15,000, and it's so insignificant compared to all of the other money, and people have offered to pay that. As a matter of fact, there are groups that have offered to pay it for 10 years, just so that other people could, so that we could take a break, take a step back, and people can think about the fact that this really is a historic building. There are so many press articles right now out there about saving it and why it's important to save it. Blair Kamen, who's a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer for the Chicago Tribune, wrote 2 of them. One said, "Wake up, Evanston leaders," and the other one was, "Evanston's plan to demolish, is it public vision or hidden agenda?" And then just yesterday, he retweeted a picture from another website that showed what they propose the site to look like, which is going to clear it all out. So I say yes, vote yes. Take the money from the people who are offering it, so it's
Thank
no
you.
cost.
Thank you.
So-
The next question is going to go to Mr. White. How much does the city currently spend on the Harley Clark annually?
How much does the city, pardon me?
How much does the city spend on it, on Harley Clark Mansion annually?
I think it's $15,000 or less. Based on, I don't work for the city, so I don't.
Repeat that.
I believe it's $15,000 or less.
Okay. Ms. DeMarco?
Yeah, it is $15,000 to mothball it, which means that there's plywood up, they shut everything off, nothing else is done to it. So my understanding, and maybe somebody from the Art Center, you can talk to people you know who are involved in the Art Center, they spend over $100,000 a year raising that money to operate the Harley Clark Mansion. So those are the only figures I have. Again, the city has never occupied the space. They've never wanted to occupy the space. They've never wanted to take that on as an asset for programming or otherwise. So yeah, I couldn't speak to how much it would cost to operate it to service the public. They never have, and the public hasn't had access in that sense.
Ms. Stieglitz?
The city spends $15,000 a year, $1,500 on fire alarm systems, $3,200 on gas and electricity, $2,500 on building maintenance materials, and $7,800 on a caretaker that goes in and checks on it every single day. They do not plan on boarding it up. They do not board it up. That equals $15,000 a year. Again, it doesn't have to cost the city any money at all. These are numbers that came from Wally Bobkowitz, and they're current. So 0 would be my answer.
Mr. McClure?
I'd have to defer to Mr. Desai in terms of what the city really spends on that. And my other concern with, quote, mothballing it for 10 years is, and I can appreciate the cost that Trish is mentioning, but in 10 years from now, if we kick the can down the road, the mansion is just going to be that much worse off in terms of condition, et cetera.
Thank you. The next question is going to go first to Mr. White. Since we have many Evanstonians who have never visited this area, how does your plan make this a more inviting place?
The plans that have been set out by the nonprofits who are interested in reusing Harley Clark makes it a more inviting place through new programming. There would be educational facilities there. There would be environmental study groups there. There would be, and there could be all sorts of other uses. There could be uses for concerts. There could be uses for book groups. There could be, I have to be careful what I say because I worry about the commercial element of this, but there could be what I would call low-impact commercial uses, including cafes. And there's also, as we've seen in Evanston, a need for co-working facilities. There could be a co-working facility there, as has been done at other mansions where they've reused the building.
Thank you. Mr. McClure.
So my concern is that ultimately, if we tried to repurpose the building, and I think Ms. DeMarco spoke to this, there is no use of that building that is going to completely pay its way. And I would suspect that a lot of the uses that Brad might be alluding to won't be permitted in that particular location. So when we talk about attractiveness of Evanston, I'm going to say that right now, our property tax burden sends a lot of people away from Evanston. And a lot of people I know actually, I know quite a few people who've moved out of here because of the property tax burden.
Ms. Stiglitz.
Repeat the question for me.
Since we have many Evanstonians who have never visited this area, how does your plan make this a more inviting place?
I don't have a plan, and I think the whole idea about this conversation is to vote yes on the referendum so that we can then take care of the property at no cost to the city while the city entertains other proposals which are out there, and Jan Schakowsky and Robin Gable and Laura Fine have come forward in the last few weeks with adaptive reuse proposals. So I think that, I don't have the answers to that today, but there are people out there who are working on it. So to tear down a building prematurely would be a shame, especially a historic building.
Ms. DeMarco?
I think that demoing the site and reserving more funds for the Park and Rec Department to use them for more free beach tokens, which are provided to free and reduced families through 65, and their free punch cards at 202 for our youth to experience the park and the lake in an open, natural landscape would be best. When I was on the board, we were always trying to find a way to make the beaches more accessible. There used to be buses, actually, that ran from Levy and other centers to the beach. Maybe we could reinstitute that. The Parks Department is not a park district. It is a department and a segment of the city that has to kind of fight for their budget. And in my 10 years, I had seen that get smaller and smaller. So maybe it would allow them some additional funds without the burden of the building so that they can use that for additional programming and possible transportation to the site.
Thank you. The next question will go first to Ms. Stiglitz. If this referendum passes, what would you expect the practical effect of that to be, given that it is not binding on City Council and a process for exploring demolition of the mansion is underway?
I would hope that the council would recognize that the majority of citizens are asking them to stop the plan to demolish the building, and that they would look at the alternative adaptive reuse studies that are coming forward, or a combined plan with the Evanston Lake House and Gardens. I know the city council says, no, we're not going back there, but they had a great plan. They had a lot of professional people working on it. They spent 3 years, and I mean, if you just count the number of hours, it was enormous, and they sincerely believe that they can still do that plan. So I would say if I would hope that the city council would then take a step back, understand that the citizens want this building to be maintained, and figure out how to move forward.
Thank you. Mr. McClure.
So my hope is that if the referendum passes, and you know what, it might, because the language is kind of seductive in terms of like minimal or no cost, and people are like, oh, that sounds great. I think a lot of people in Evanston love things like this, but they want somebody else to pay for it. And the problem I have in this particular conversation is that, you know, Jan Schakowsky hasn't shown up with the big check. Robin Gable hasn't shown up with the big check, and I don't think Laura Fine's going to show up with the big check. Nobody's showing up with the big check. And I think ultimately, City Council, if the referendum passes, that's going to be at the core of their decision-making. Nobody has shown up with the big check.
Mr. White.
I would hope that if the referendum passes, the city abates its move toward demolition for at least 18 to 24 months to give the not-for-profits an opportunity to pull their ideas together, to expand on their current ideas, and to raise the funds necessary to rehab this building. You know, the Lake House and Gardens people already retained a fundraising consultant, a fundraising expert from the community, but there has been very little opportunity to raise funds. People don't just show up with checks. They need to be assured that their money will be able to be used when the city, but in the midst of the time when the city's saying, no, we're going to tear this building down, why is anyone going to put money in a bank account for an idea? If the city says, okay, we're going to give you 24 months, then it will happen.
Thank you. Mr. Marco.
So if the referendum passes, we start this process all over again. We start looking at, again, the city had already put out a request for proposals of use, adaptive use to the space. It had been done 4 years ago, and here we are. So it just starts over again. And in that 4 years, there was no plan or program that came to fruition, and I feel that's where we're at right now. The city does not want to put money into the space. They do not want to utilize the space for their own uses. That's why we're at demolition. It starts all over again. It takes up time in the community collective, in our discussion and our issues. I think we have more important things we need to be talking about. There are more important things to be fundraising. You know, again, you mentioned Crown. It took 20 years to get to where we're at with Robert Crown, and it has been successful because there was a group of people who started raising that money first, who started a separate entity to raise money, and they were able to do so without plans because it was something that the city sorely needed. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question will go first to Mr. McClure. Robert Crown was under review for 18 years, while the library was under review for 12 years. Why the rush for a decision on Harley Clark?
I don't think we're rushing for a decision. How many years have we been having this conversation on the Harley Clark? You know, it's been many years, to my recollection. Even before the EAC moved out, we were having this conversation. So I don't think anyone is rushing to judgment. I think we're saying it's time to actually make a decision. And, you know, my thing is, I would hope people vote no on the referendum because we need to move beyond this, like I said in the round table.
Mr. White.
We're at this rush to decision because the city has always wanted to demo this building. And I think we're also at the rush to this decision because there are some number of people, 75, probably less than that, who have come to the city and have said, we're going to fund this demolition. Instead of coming to the city and said, we really think that we should save this building and we'll put some money towards saving it. No, they want to demolish it, and I don't know why they don't want to demolish it. Partly because most of the money is coming from the neighborhood, I don't know. So I don't think we've spent that many years. There's been no city leadership to move this forward. The city has said, no, no. They weren't even bargaining in good faith with the last proposer. How can city staff come to an agreement and then the city council say, no, that's not what we wanted? Why didn't they go back and say, okay, well, let's renegotiate? What was going on there behind the scenes?
Hey, quiet, please. I ask the audience to be very quiet. No applause, please. Mr. Marco.
Yeah, so Robert Crown is the most highly used civic center in this city. It also is the one that generates the most income. I think they're able to generate 80% of their income. And it's 40 years old. And once again, Harley Clark, city's owned it for over 40 years, never occupied, never used. I think, yes, the reason why this is taking a shorter amount of time is because it is not an asset that is being used by our community. It is not being used by any portion of our community. They don't have access to it. There is nothing there at this time. The other centers are being highly and heavily used. So that is why we should be putting our money into those things and getting the maintenance done on those things. And our fundraising dollars should go to those things that get used. We shouldn't be spending as much time on something that the city has never utilized. Many people who were for the Parkland group that came up after the Pritzker proposal and worked to stop that going, that were part of Green Space and Parkland, also ended up donating money to the groups, are now for demolition, because they've come to that point as well.
Thank you. And how many more seconds did she take? 9? Okay, so you get 9 more seconds, Ms. Stiglitz.
Okay, so thank you. I have to disagree again, Ms. DeMarco. The Art Center was used and used heavily. They did not put money into it. They didn't take care of it. That's a fact. The Robert Crown, yes, used heavily. They also didn't put money into it or take care of it. That's how come we're spending $55 million today. And it's just disingenuous to say that they should spend all the money on a Robert Crown Center and not on something else. Not everybody goes to Robert Crown. My kids didn't go there. My kids went to the library. And they're putting a library there, but that library is not in the 5th Ward. The 5th Ward is here. We're in the 5th Ward. They're putting a library on Main Street that costs $5 million. So good, glad, but it's disingenuous to say that that building deserves more money than any other building. First of all, the library also, I am part of the library system, and I was part of that whole discussion when they wanted to close the libraries, and our city spends $2 compared to Skokie, who spends $12. And I'm just saying, those numbers aren't right, but the comparison is right. So we saved these branch libraries. When they closed the South Branch, we built a South Branch and opened it up, and it was folded into the libraries today.
Thank you. We have 5 minutes left, and I'm going to try to see if we can get through a couple more, 2 or 3 more questions. So the next, Ms. DeMarco will answer the next question first. How can the voters be 100% assured that the city will not have to contribute any money to the destruction of the mansion and the associated work, landscaping, et cetera?
I don't think in either option you can be 100% assured of that. What I can say is that the Dunes Group has raised almost $400,000, which is more than what the projected demolition costs are at this time. We don't know what is going to be revisioned after that, but from what I've read, they have offered to continue fundraising to see that project to fruition, but I don't think in either project you can say that the city won't spend any money. When the Art Center left, they received a lot of dollars from the city in that transition. They received free permitting, they received free dumpsters. The city ate a lot of money for the Art Center to rebuild and move to Central Street. So there's always, I think there's always a hidden cost to taxpayer. I wouldn't pretend to be able to state what that could be.
Thank you. Mr. White.
I think all we can do is go to the memorandum of understanding that has been negotiated between the city and the Dunes Group, and it limits the the Dunes Group to $400,000. And I think it's been clear from what we have talked about today that, one, we do not believe that the demolition costs that have been shown to date, because they don't show a full scope of services, would be able to be done for $400,000. And at the very least, we have no plan for what's going to go in place of Harley Clark Mansion. And whatever park goes there, for it to be a real park, is going to cost some hundreds of thousands of dollars, because you've got to ensure that the, well, I guess dunes are restored, and ensure that the lakeshore doesn't subside, and ensure that the retaining walls are done, and ensure that from the grotto to the other place that water continues to flow. So we have no idea, but I do know that they're only limited to $400,000, and whatever other discussions they've had, they've had.
Mr. McClure.
So I believe the Dunes Group has actually committed in total to $500,000. And I think Ms. DeMarco is right, where, you know what, there's some risk for the city, but I will say it's either way. And I would say that if the city goes down the path of keeping the mansion, the costs are much higher and the risk to the city is much greater. You know, Brad, I saw that you were involved with Unity Temple. I love Unity Temple. If this were Unity Temple sitting on the lakefront, you know what? I'd be leading the parade to preserve it, but it's not. This is a McMansion. It just happens to be one that was built in 1927.
Thank you. Mr. White will have the next question.
I didn't get it.
I'm sorry, Ms. Stiglitz, go ahead.
Thank you. So Brad's right. The memorandum of understanding that was executed by actually 5 people and 1 non-for-profit organization to offer $400,000 to tear down the building does not recognize what the council voted 9-0 on, which is no cost to the taxpayers. No cost, which means that they can't know what that will be until engineer drawings are done and it goes out to RFP, and it has to state that change orders will be covered, that for unforeseen conditions that happen in every single construction project on earth. Demo people have said that they will not issue a blank check. So there's no way to guarantee that this will be no cost to the citizens. And that's what it should be. And that's what the council voted for.
Thank you. The next question will go first to Mr. White. If the referendum prevails, do you believe the council is responsible to identify a reuse?
If the referendum prevails, I believe the council is responsible to reset its thinking, to, again, abate any discussion of demolition, and to get the parties together and see what can be done to come up with some reuses at no cost to the city. I am not up here advocating that the city spend $5 million on this building or any millions of dollars on this building. I am up here because I believe that this building is important to the city of Evanston, and that we don't just save high landmarks such as Unity Temple, and that if we did, we wouldn't be saving any buildings from the Harlem Renaissance, from the Great Migration, and again, we wouldn't be saving Foster School. So I think the city has an obligation, if the referendum passes, to stop all discussions of demolition and move forward with reuse.
Thank you. How many seconds did he go over? 4, okay. I thought it was more. Ms. Stiglitz. No, I'm sorry. Mr. McClure.
So this is a non-binding referendum, and I don't think the city is under any obligation. I think they can consider, but I think ultimately the city council is responsible for all of Evanston, and Evanston offers so much. And Evanston is so much more than just this one big house that happens to sit on the lakefront. So I think the city council, if it passes, they're still, at the end of the day, this is an economic question. And as I wrote in the roundtable, economics is an or question. In Evanston, many think it's an and question, like we can have it all, we can have, everything. Sorry, but we can't. And the city council is going to have to answer the or question. And I think we've already answered it with the Robert Crown rebuild that is going on.
Thank you. Ms. Stiglitz.
If the referendum passes, I think it's incumbent on the council to take a step back and look at it and understand that it's a public asset and there's value to every asset we have. And this is an incredible one. And some of the council members do see it. And it's not all of the council that wants to tear this building down at all. On the other side, it's 5 individuals and 1 non-for-profit, and then there's thousands. We have petitions for thousands of people. How is it that a public asset can be paid for to be destroyed by our citizens? I've never seen it happen before. It makes no sense. And this is an equity issue and a social justice issue as well. And they need to take a step back and look at all of it and start from scratch. That's my opinion.
Thank you. Ms. DeMarco.
If it does pass, I hope that the council will, do a true cost and benefit analysis of all options on the table. So including looking at possibilities of preservation, but looking at also of what it means to reclaim the property in perpetuity for everyone to have access, and demolition. They should keep in mind all proposals that are up, and they should do a true cost-benefit analysis of what that means for the citizens in Evanston.
Thank you. And I have 4 o'clock, so I am going to call this forum closed. And thank you to the panelists. And thank you to the audience for all of your questions. There are still some that weren't asked. I'm sorry we didn't get to them all. Thank you again, everyone. And the forum will be...
Thank you so much.
And go to lwve.org if you want to see the forum again.